ladies and gentlemen, wages in the United States are rising quickly, and that's very good news. Or is it? And are wages rising really? Jeff Snyder, the head of global research at Alhambra Partners, gives us a clue in the title of a recent article. He writes, "What if more rapid published wage increases are actually evidence of deflationary conditions?" Published, meaning what is it that we don't see? And is that important? We're actually going to talk about what happened in the 1930s when wages surged. No one would confuse that as some sort of inflationary 1970s. No, here we are again, another depression, a silent depression. Wages are again surging, and we're going to learn why about it. It's an interesting phenomenon if the acronym for it is not interesting. Jeff, you posted this article on the, let's see here, I can't see, on the 3rd of January 2022. And you start out by informing us that the central bank of the Federal Reserve is not a central bank, meaning they don't focus on money supply and money demand. Therefore, they're focused on narrative and looking at different economic aggregates. One of them is the unemployment rate, which we've beaten to death over many years, saying that it's illusory, or at best it's misleading, that there's much more to it. It's too simple just to look at the headline number. And perhaps another one of those economic aggregates that they look at that may be misleading is wages. I would think if wages are rising, that's an inflationary sign.
You would think so, right? I mean, higher wages sound like exactly what the narrative is. As we just said in the previous segment, the Federal Reserve doesn't look at money supply for inflation because, as Alan Greenspan admitted many times in the 1990s, they don't do money. So in lieu of being able to do anything about money, in lieu of being an actual central bank, what do you do for non-money monetary policy? You look at these economic aggregates and sort of work backwards from them and sort of say, well, if inflation's good and where we want it to be, and the economy is generally healthy and wages are generally rising, then monetary policy must be successful. If we look at those things, unemployment rates falling, which means the competition for workers is heating up, means wages are rising more rapidly. That sounds like, hey, that's a lot of good things together. So monetary policy, as well as any other non-policy factors, must be favorable. Therefore, we should look at not just, hey, this is great, wages are up, labor market seems to be tight. Maybe we should start thinking about whether or not it becomes too tight and whether or not that can lead to the other problem, which is an inflationary problem, which is what everybody had talked about in 2021 for good reason. CPI rates through the roof. And as the Federal Reserve enters 2022 with CPI rates through the roof, the way it calibrates and the way it thinks about inflationary pressures is expectations as well as this tight labor market stuff. So the Fed is concerned about the people are getting normalized to high CPI rates for whatever reasons, even though the reasons might be transitory for last year's supply shock stuff. That, once people get normalized and they anchor inflation expectations much higher than they had been, for the Fed anyway, that's a theoretical problem. And then you combine that with this, what looks like a tightening labor market, and all of a sudden you've got the potential for a wage spiral to contribute to those higher unanchored inflation expectations. And you can see why the Federal Reserve, at least in the ECB in Europe, are so interested in becoming hawks and tapering and rate hikes and all this other stuff, because according to their theoretical approach, all of these inflationary warning signs are blaring on their dashboard. Wages, unemployment rate, inflation expectations, unanchored, all of these things that the Fed really cares about because it doesn't care about money.
Jeff, inflation expectations, we still keep bringing it up. But last year, towards the end of last year, there was a researcher at the Fed that said that no, that we believe.
There's no evidence.
Yeah, we believe inflation.
It's completely baseless.
We've always been doing it this way.
Again, I know. I mean, this is what Alan Greenspan was actually complaining about. If you really read his speeches in the late 1990s, on the one hand, he was admitting we don't do money, but what he was really doing is complaining. He's like, what do we do? We're left with all this other stuff that is really unsatisfactory. And one of those other stuff we're left with is this inflation expectations nonsense. And as you're right, Jeremy Rudd was a pretty well-known researcher at the Federal Reserve, said, why are we still on this inflation expectation stuff? Because there is no evidence for it. And the reason the Fed still does it is because it doesn't have anything else. which should really trouble people, especially if the Fed is saying, we're absolutely certain that there's going to be inflation coming because we don't know, because we have no other way of deciding inflation and all these other things that we actually do, expectations, this labor market stuff doesn't really work in the real world, but they have nothing else. And that really should be troubling to people that they're using all of this evidence-free theories to set non-money monetary policies, which people need to realize are non-money monetary policies. So this whole thing is really a confidence game. It's really about projecting we have all of this stuff that back up our assertion that we need to be hawkish in our monetary policies. And if you believe that the Fed is a bunch of enlightened philosophers doing the best and creating the most optimal outcomes in the economy, then you'll act as if that's the case. And that's really what the Fed is actually betting on. It's crafting this facade of competence and technical proficiency when there actually is none of those things. And it's really the facade that's the point here. If the Fed could convince the public, especially with the financial media uniformly behind them, parroting their every word and move and telling the world how great it is, then the idea is this technocratic experiment can work through psychology. And so it's all about crafting this image. It really is the Wizard of Oz, this fiery floating head that everybody should just be, don't fight the Fed. Just do what you're told. Don't think too much about it because these people know what they're doing. When in truth, they don't. They really don't.
One seemingly incontrovertible measure that they can point to, suggesting inflation, encouraging their extreme tapering and rate increase mania that they've announced recently, is wage increases, which have been rising very quickly. You tell us, though, in the 1930s, we saw something similar. I'm going to read from your quote right now. 1930s. The more millions left for the charity of soup lines before starvation, the higher the real wage rate had climbed. The head-scratching result even has a fancy name, SRIRL, SRIRL, or short-run increasing returns to labor. And that quote comes from a December 31st essay at Real Clear Markets, which is titled 2021 Began with Promise, Ends on a Sour Note. You tell us some more. According to one of the data sets, real wage rates increased by an enormously confounding 16% during 1930, 1931. Awful years. What was happening? The same years when some measures of unemployment rates skyrocketed from around 3% in 1929 to upwards of 20% and more entering 1932. Here's possibly the key. While nominal wage rates did decline in most American industries during the Great Collapse, it was far less than overall prices had. Thus, the real wage jumped up by a sizable figure, projecting higher relative labor costs onto firms. And then you explain that there are two reasons why we may see surging wages. What are those two reasons?
Well, there's actually several reasons that have been put forward over the years for this. But yeah, let's start with that. I mean, how many people would have guessed? I mean, most people don't spend their time looking back at the 1930s and studying the Great Depression closely, though I would recommend you do that. But anyway, I mean, most people would probably be shocked to learn that, yes, real wages and even nominal wages in the latter part of the Great Depression, but real wages skyrocketed during the worst couple years in U.S. economic history. That's confusing. That's confounding. That's stunning. How could that possibly happen? Once you hear this, you're not alone in your surprise, because for many years, economists were stunned and confused too. They tried to figure out how could that be, because it's so counterintuitive. You would think that during a depressionary collapse of that magnitude, businesses would be cutting their wages as fast as they possibly can in addition to cutting their workforce, in order to keep up, to survive, to keep up, keep cutting costs to keep up with falling revenues. And that's not what happened. What we find is this confounding surreal. I don't know how to say it.
Shrill.
It's SRIRL. I don't know if it's an acronym so much as just an abbreviation, but I mean, how do we explain this short run increasing returns to labor, which is a fancy name for wages going up in a depression? And there are several ways to do that. I mean, just quite simply, some have proposed a technology shock, some have proposed labor hoarding. There's also something called the overhead effect and all sorts of other things that when you start getting beyond, I know you made a point of pointing out the word published, the weasel word in the title of the article, because when we look at wages, we usually look at the aggregated average that the BLS puts out or whatever data set it happens to be. And what happened in the 1970s and 1980s was that people realize that maybe we need to look beyond these aggregated wage rates or the aggregated headlines to start looking at disaggregated data, firm level data or industry level data, and really trying to figure out what's going on. And what they said was, look, the published wage rate went up, but that doesn't really tell us the whole story. In fact, it left out most of the important parts of the story, which when you get into these explanations of labor hoarding and technology shocks and all these other things, what it really tells you is that the published rate went up because of all these other things that we don't see in the numbers, which, it starts to sound a lot like the interest rate fallacy and what goes on in interest rates when you see, the published rate of, government bond yields fall, but we don't see the rates of mom and pop, what they would be charged on loans because they don't get loans at all. They fall off the radar completely. And so the published part of the Great Depression looks at it one way when what really happened may be something different.
Survivor bias and labor hoarding. You mentioned labor hoarding. We'll get to that. How about survivor bias? How might that explain why wages rose during the Great Depression and maybe right now as well?
Well, survivor bias during the Great Depression, and this is something that Ben Bernanke actually studied and wrote a couple of decent papers on. Yes, that Ben Bernanke, who was actually a relatively good scholar back in his day. He may not have been a great monetary policy maker, but he was a very good, especially when we talk about the Great Depression, he was a very good scholar and produced a lot of good scholarship, including several papers on this SRIRL phenomenon. And survivor bias is simply when we look at the firms that didn't survive, the companies that went out of business during the Great Collapse and the Great Depression, what they found was that most often these were low productivity, low paying either companies or segments of industries or particular plants or particular parts of businesses. And they were survived by the better companies, those that were more highly productive and therefore could pay a higher wage. So like the survivor bias in any stock index, for example, what happens is the published wage rate doesn't account for all of those low pay, low wage firms that go out of business. And so suddenly those disappear. And what's left are these higher paying companies, these higher paying jobs, which in the published aggregate makes it look like wages increased when what really happened was this deflationary shock that got rid of all of the lesser paying opportunities.
Another possibility, labor reserve. Can you tell us that that companies would keep workers around even though they didn't need them? And also perhaps that they were keeping higher paid workers. Tell us what labor reserve might explain with an increase in the 1930s wage rate and perhaps today too.
Yeah, there's sort of a survivor bias on that micro level too, right? Because you're a firm faced with obvious revenue difficulties, but you think maybe I'm going to get through this, I'm going to survive, there's going to be recovery at some point. So you're thinking about who do I let go? Well, I'm going to let go of the employees who I'm very, very sure aren't really adding much value other than the bare minimum, who tend to be lower paying jobs or lower paid employees. So you let those people go and keep the more valuable employees because that makes perfect sense. There's intuitive sense there. You don't really need to explain why you do that because look, you're thinking about the future and yes, it's bad today, but eventually down the road, it will be better. So even in that sense, the lower paying jobs get culled from the economy. They get those jobs and their wage rates get pulled out of the published aggregates, and it looks like the wage rate goes higher. And there's also another phenomenon known as labor hoarding. This reservoir or reserve of labor where companies say, look, I know I have to pay my employees a certain amount of money just to keep them on. You can't cut them down in hours and wages. Eventually, they will, the employees are going to say, you're not paying me enough during a given week that I can survive. I have to go someplace else. So if you really want to keep this employee around, you have to pay them, say, a certain weekly amount to make it worth their while to stick around, even if maybe you don't have enough work for them to do. So what happens is, yes, they work less hours, but you don't necessarily cut their pay as much as the amount of hours that are reduced. And so the average wage for that employee goes way up, even though they're working a lot less, just because you have to pay them some minimal amount to stick around. And I think this is really what we saw a lot of in March and April of 2020, where I think that was the phenomenon we saw where wages skyrocketed in those 2 months because of the same kind of thing. Not just a labor reservoir, but also the survivorship bias, where companies said, "Look, we're going to be shut down for a couple months, but we want to keep certain people around, even if that means paying them more than there is available work."
We can see that in two charts that you provide us in this article. The first chart shows the year-over-year increase in average weekly earnings and average hourly earnings, including 4 recessions. So it's from the 1980s all the way to present day. And we see that during the first 3 recessions, we didn't see this effect, but it's during this fourth one where we do see this increase. And I think Jeff, it has to do with that it was a shock like the Great Depression, whereas the other 3 recessions were not shocks. This one was devastation on par with the Great Depression. I heard that wages increased during the Black Plague in Europe. That seems like a shock where this sort of thing would happen. And then, as you were just explaining a moment ago on our second graph, we have the actual nominal value as opposed to a year-over-year increase. And we can see that spike, Jeff. We can see that huge spike in average hourly earnings and weekly earnings as well. Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, in the timing of it, right, Emil? It's during the collapse. It wasn't like afterward when all Uncle Sam's helicopter money started flowing through the economy, or the PPP grants. It wasn't anything like that. It was during the collapse when these wage rates went up most, which I think is pretty incontroversial these days, that was probably labor hoarding and survivor bias in the wage data. That's why wages went up. And then, so the more interesting and maybe questionable phenomenon is whether or not that has continued into 2021 and maybe into 2022. We don't really have good answers for that, at least from the wage data itself. I'm raising that as a possibility, given all the other labor data seems to suggest, including the labor force numbers, which indicate that maybe that is what's going on here, that we're not seeing inflationary wages at all, but rather the questionable deflationary wages that we saw during the Great Depression. And that's another point I want to make too, and want to stress, is that it wasn't just during 1930, 31, and 32 when real wage rates went up. They went up the most during those years, but they stayed up throughout the entire Great Depression because some of those things never went away. The economy, for a lot of reasons, but most of the monetary reasons, never really recovered. And so this phenomenon of SRIRL was sort of a constant thing for whatever reason or explanation you prefer, whether it's labor hoarding, technology shock, survivor bias, or whatever it was, a combination of those things. It wasn't just a one-time thing either. It continued throughout that period. So I wonder if maybe we're not seeing the same thing since 2020, since the labor market itself and data outside of wages, despite the unemployment rate, continues to suggest that, yeah, maybe that is the case.
But the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, doesn't believe so, Jeff. That's how you end your article, and that's how we'll end the show, is that they believe this is not one of those SRIRL situations, that this is a real beginning to what may lead to further inflation. They're looking at the nominal numbers, nominal inflation rates.
Well, we don't have time to discuss this today, but I don't think they actually believe that. But they want you to believe they believe that. Going back to how we started this segment here, the Fed is crafting a facade. And so they're using anything and everything available to say that this is a legitimate phenomenon or legitimate policy. And so if they're turning to hawkishness because of inflationary pressures, they're going to interpret all the data in whatever data it can be in that fashion, because they're trying to fashion a facade for you. I don't believe for a second that the Fed actually believes the wage data is inflationary, but it's useful for them to construct what they're trying to do, which is the psychological
They want to create a self-perpetuating, self-reinforcing, real economic effect, because they're telling the economy, this is inflationary, look at wages, look at nominal inflation rates, and therefore consumers and businesses will act as if it's inflationary. And I guess that makes sense, Jeff, but they're just in a bubble, aren't they? they need to get outside and walk around and talk to other people that are not in the media or not in the academic sphere. It's been 15 years where this narrative, they're just hitting their head against the wall. They can't do you think they realize that their message is hollow one and no one believes this? Or no, they're just
No, I don't think
they are.
I know that they do know it's hollow. They do know how unsatisfactory all this stuff is. Again, going back to Greenspan in the 1990s, which was really complaint. And again, as we just referenced, Jeremy Rudd's paper, which hit the establishment like a ton of bricks. You know, his saying, "Why are we still doing expectations? There's no evidence for." The impetus behind that paper was this stuff doesn't seem to work. But again, why is the Fed continue to rely on these things? Because they don't have anything else. And so, yeah, I think there is a level of awareness inside the institution. But when your entire existence is depending upon maintaining this Wizard of Oz type illusion, you can see why they do what they do. Now, it doesn't make it right. That doesn't mean we should be sympathetic to these people. But you can see why they're doing these things, and what they're actually doing isn't what you think they're doing.
I guess they'll get air cover from the business press and financial media after it goes bad, so they're not worried about looking foolish as soon as this year. I guess I can't understand it. Why? Okay.
There's no institutional incentives for change and for improvement. That's really part of the problem. You know, the Fed independence is talked about in terms of politics when what it really has meant is lack of accountability. Nobody's allowed to criticize the Fed, and that extends to the financial media. That extends to its critics. You're not allowed to criticize the Federal Reserve. Otherwise, you're going to be deemed some kind of crank. And that's really what's happened here. As you said, this bubble that the Fed is in, they've created it for themselves out of necessity. This is what Greenspan's complaint was really about. What he was really saying is that since we don't do money, we have to put ourselves onto this pedestal, this bubbled pedestal. And that's the only way to conduct any possible or regional, they think is rational policy regime, because they're not really a central bank anymore. And so they have to pretend they are. And in pretending they have to do all these ridiculous things to maintain the illusion.
We are going to talk about money in part 3 of this episode by reviewing October's Treasury International Capital Report, which offers a dim view, a keyhole view of what may be happening in the global monetary order and where we're heading next with the economy.